Встречайте, Stimberg, директор департамента инфраструктурных решений в регионе Dach and Russia, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise.
Good morning, everyone. I won't switch to Russian, to be honest. I could do it in German, unfortunately. But welcome also from my side. Thank you for Marion inviting me. Always a pleasure actually being here before the summer ends, also Moscow. Last time was June. I must admit June is a little bit even better than now. But really happy to be here. Great event. So when I was invited, I thought about what do I present to you, and you'll actually not see a lot of HPE products in this presentation. I can only encourage you to go to the HPE booth out there, so you see tons of hardware and products there if you want to see. But as you can see with the title, I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends, and I would say the opportunities, but also threats. I would say for us in Europe, including you in Russia, and I think I'll leave you with some advices on where to focus on and how we can work together on some things. A haystack of needles, I wasn't sure whether it fully translates. There is this saying in English, it works in German as well, to find a needle in a haystack. I'll explain later what I mean by a haystack of needles, right? Now, I want to talk about the haystack, and as my the previous presenter talked a lot about data, you can imagine this is a lot about data. But I think we're at the beginning of a new era, a new phase, which, as I said, comes with a lot of opportunity. But there's certain things we need to do. So I'm going to talk about the gap and the need to act together. But let me explain what I mean by a haystack of needles first. And I want to use an example which I think affects all of us, hopefully not too many of us directly, but society and as a whole. And it's about actually a disease. So bear with me, hopefully this is not going to be too negative start. But I want to talk about William Ottomone, and I was interested, I came in, some people actually know him. He's a drawer, born in Philadelphia, moved to London where he actually in 2007 died, and he's famous for his portraits, right? You see one here. What's so special and why I'm talking about this artist? William was diagnosed Alzheimer back at the age of 62, right? But he continued drawing portraits of himself until he couldn't anymore, right? Now what you see here is actually right after that diagnosis was done. If you look at that picture, I think it looks quite strong, right? You just learned about a disease which will change your life. But I think this picture looks like he was really ready to fight back on that disease, right? Now a year later that already changed, right? Somehow it looks like as if he has given up, the eyes, the mouth are no longer smiling. Another year later, you start seeing the face vanish quite a bit. If you go on, 1999, so about 4 years, 3-4 years after, that diagnosis was done, no real eyes anymore, no face, it's diminishing. And then the last picture in 2000, that was actually the last picture he drew. You see even the color is gone. Now, Alzheimer or dementia is a big, big problem for society, right? Worldwide, and it's hard, it's an estimate, people estimate there's about 50 million people, that have dementia. In Russia, there's estimates it's 1.5 million right now, similar in Germany. The big problem is, as population gets older, there's the expectation that over the next 2-3 decades, this is at least going to triple, right? And what you can see from these pictures is it affects obviously the individual, but there might be the one or the other in the audience that has relatives that have Alzheimer or dementia. Obviously affects those, but it's also a huge cost to the society. Now the problem with Alzheimer is we still don't know what the cause is, right? And there's no cure. There's some, there is some research done, and there are certain gene defects and sequences that might affect it. We believe that if you exercise a lot, that helps, but there's really no core root cause identified and no cure. So there is a non-profit research organization in Germany called DZNE, and they work with a lot of other research institutes across the globe, right? And they basically started a long-term study to try to find the causes and ultimately help to find a cure for Alzheimer, right? And what they do is they basically have identified 30,000 volunteers that over the course of the next 30 years are going to participate in that study. And they will basically, take, a full profile of their genome. They will, go to the hospital, blood tests every couple of months. They will track, their lifestyle, what they eat, how they exercise, right? Every little disease, even if it's, just a cold or something, will be tracked. They do brain scans all of the time and collect all that data to actually analyze it and find out what's the root cause. Because the one thing that seems to be clear is that Alzheimer actually breaks out 20 to 30 years before you see the symptoms. So that's why they're doing 30 years with 30,000 people analyzing that. Now you can just imagine the amount of data they're collecting, right? We're talking hundreds and hundreds to thousands of petabytes ultimately they're going to collect and analyze. Collecting and storing is probably not the biggest problem, We still lose a lot of tape. I saw that on the Intel slide at the bottom, right? But actually analyzing that data is really, really, really tricky, right? And I come to back to that on what they're doing and how they're doing, and how we're working together with DZNE, HPE, to make that possible. Now, the growth of data is one thing, and analyzing it is the other thing. And the DZNE is just one example of many industries, right? And it's interesting, I have manufacturing, we'll talk about predictive maintenance, the finance industry are moving from just, models to, artificial intelligence, identifying pattern in huge amounts of historic data. But as we're all IT professionals, also the IT infrastructure on how to basically get away from base troubleshooting of infrastructure, kind of trying to fix a failure after it happens, of optimizing infrastructure through human beings. Because one thing that this data growth brings with it is just, there's no way that a human being can analyze it manually. Now, as I said before, I think we've been talking about data as being the new gold and information being the new gold for quite a while, so that's new. But I think we're at the beginning of a new phase, right? And if we look back at how the industry, the IT industry developed, it's kind of moving from centralized to distributed to centralized. If you look at the mainframe work, very centralized. If you look at that in the client-server world, distributed. And we're back to kind of the cloud mobile world, right? Where you have and it's changing, right? We're at the beginning, but you have a rather dumb device and you kind of send everything into the cloud, right? Now, I mentioned before new phase, opportunity, and threats. I think each of these phases has brought winners and losers in the industry, right? And I think the mobile cloud world, we talk about the Googles, the Facebooks, the Yandexes of this world that have won. But I think we're now on edge where there is an opportunity, especially for us in Europe, to come back. Now, if this moves, I think I spoke about data growth, right? And you've probably seen all these graphs, right? Get used to big numbers and yotta and zettabytes. I think we're soon going out of the petabyte range here. But I think next to the data growth, the other thing that happens is the source and the use of the data is changing, right? And there's 3 examples here. The first one is what we're all used to, structured data. We call that often systems of records. Take whatever retail company, this is just the Walmart example, 40 petabytes, structured data, it's inventory data and all that kind of stuff. It needs to be very precise. But to be honest, if the inventory level of bananas is 2 hours old, it doesn't kill you to take a decision, right? Now, the next level that we're all living in today is the world of human data, right? You all have a mobile phone. I just took a few pictures, contributed to that. We call those systems of engagement because it's human, creating data and others humans using the data. And you see the amount or the magnitude of the jump of how much data is being generated, right? The precision of the data is maybe not as important, but I think all of us would be very unhappy if they can't watch the video that a friend just sent us before. I think where we're now going is a new space where I think what we're going to see, and some might like, some might not like it, is the digitization of the analog world, right? This is just the example of the autonomous self-driving car, but you can look at everything. How many of you wear a smartwatch, tracking their health status, right? Let's talk about smart clothes. I think what we're going to see in retail stores and shopping malls, manufacturing plants, everywhere. Even had a discussion about, an owner of a fitness center, small, not a big chain fitness center, who started, making all the equipment kind of intelligent. So I think we're going to growingly see that everything around us is going to send kind of information, and those will be digitized, right? Now that A creates that curve you saw before, right? The growth of the data. But B also means it's actually different data, and we're having kind of analog data, not structured data, having been analyzed by computers because that sheer amount we can't analyze anymore. The other thing here is, and that's why I say system of action, there's many use cases where that data now is automatically translated into action. The autonomous driving car is just the most extreme example. A computer is now deciding what the car does, right? Whether it stops or doesn't stop, right? So the consequences are just a completely different level, right? So it's not just the data grows, but also how it's used and where it's generated and what type of data it is. Now, the thing, and you can already imagine, and Intel spoke about it before, I think we're still living in a world today where most of the data is being generated and processed in the data center. And only a small amount, 10%, is actually done outside of the data center. But as you can imagine, those things, and we're in it today, right, will rapidly change. Right? Just in 2-3 years, we expect that the majority of the data is actually no longer generated in the data center, and as a consequence, also not processed in the data center, because those sheer amounts, there's no way you can ship them back to a data center, to the cloud, process them, and ship them back. Just think of, if it's a system of action, shipping the data over the network somewhere and getting it back is gonna kill the whole thing. So, we need to get ready to process data at the edge. And the edge is different things for depending on what business you're in, right? But as I said, it can even be kind of the fitness center around the corner. And it's not just the big manufacturing plants. And that's what I mean. We're entering a new phase. Data growth has been there, it's just accelerating, but where it's generated and produced changes. Now, why is that an opportunity for us? Because as I said before, I think the previous phase, the mobile cloud phase, has probably brought, a lot of companies and US companies to life, the Googles, the Facebooks and stuff. But we're now entering that phase of digitalization of the analog world, right? Let's be honest, in Europe, and that for me includes Russia, we own the things, right? We are the manufacturers, right? And I think that's the opportunity. If we do realize that chance and that opportunity, but also the threat, I think there is the opportunity to become the next players in the next world. Now there is a problem, as always. If it would be that easy, everyone would be doing it. And the problem is one thing, as data grows, unfortunately, one of the most famous laws in IT, Moore's law, is kind of coming to an end, right? While data explodes, CPU processing power doesn't necessarily can cope with that, right? How do you do that? So we need to think about as IT vendors and developers and researchers, and how do we address that going forward. As a result, and my number doesn't fully match the Intel one, but it's still a small number. There is only 6% or 95% and 94% of their data not being used today because we have no way to process it right now, right? Which means it's a huge opportunity how to do that. Now it's a new phase, a new opportunity, a new threat. And I want to just quickly mention the threat here as well, where I think we need to step up. Because if you look at, in Europe, we're still behind investing into certain technologies, artificial intelligence. And I'm not talking necessarily about the vendors, the classic IT infrastructure vendors, but also you as kind of the next stage, the solution providers or the actual providers of the service. So I think we need to wake up and invest into that. And I think that edge-centric kind of world, that phase we're entering, gives us that opportunity because we're actually at the edge. We own kind of the edge as companies. So are we all doomed? No. But I think I always like to put a little bit more of the pessimistic view on, right? If you're too optimistic, you might find yourself being overtaken by someone else. So I think it's important, especially in this fast-moving world, to be a little bit pessimistic. And I want to just give you some examples of what we're doing in HPE and what we have done in HPE, but also how we can help you across some of these things. The first thing is, when you look back a couple of years ago, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, as HPE, we're at the high state of, our server market share. We're the undisputed #1 in the server space. Now, what we did at that point in time, and that was quite unusual also for us, is we actually invested a huge amount of research money and people into what a lot of you heard about as the machine, as a project. And quite unusual if you followed HPE or HP at that point in time. We did actually talk about before we had a product, right? We actually went out. HP has never done that before. We're an engineering company. If the product is not 150% ready, we wouldn't talk about it. So quite a change to do that. Now, the machine was a big name for big projects, a lot of, research outcomes. There's also the whole photoelectronics piece, which we're working with a lot of vendors out of it. But one thing that goes back to my gap before is we're actually been investing into what we call memory-driven compute. So the fact that today's world is still processor-centric, right? You have a processor and you have memory, and that whenever data needs to be processed, it's being moved out of the different stages of memory into the CPU, in and out, and processed. And DZ&E is a good example. To run one of their jobs, they have to scrap at least through about 100 terabytes or something like that in one job. They can't split it up into multiple, right? And when they did this in the usual way, basically they were reading small chunks in and out through memory stages, and it took just days, hours. So what we've done with them, right, is basically using this memory-driven compute technology. And what you see here is actually the prototype a couple of years ago in the labs, which is basically a single memory, a compute machine with a single memory of 160 terabytes. Single memory, addressable and accessible by, I think at that point in time, I think a couple of dozen CPUs, right? We've progressed since then. There is even bigger systems now in the labs. We actually have first products. We have a development community around it, because this also involves changing the whole I/O stack of an operating system. So there is Linux SDKs out. And we basically had DZ&E collaborating with us and using that to run their jobs. Basically, they were for the first time now able to basically put an entire kind of data set into memory and process it, and the processing speed moved really down to minutes, even seconds for the same thing. Now DZ&E now has a machine actually on site in the data center using our Superdome technology with a special Linux build to run that, and they currently have 48 terabytes as a single memory, and that's going to process. But I think it's an example how, as a company, even if you're the top of your kind of market, you have to think about changing and investing and taking risks, because there was a lot of risk and there was a lot of money invested in that. But I think the outcomes are proven, and you're going to see a lot more of that technology moving into our products. As I said, there is on Superdome, there is a version of that available already for use. Now that's just one example, but then more concretely also for you, we're continuing to invest into technologies. I mentioned artificial intelligence for the infrastructure, right? I've been, in IT for quite a while, as most of you, and it's still scary how we treat infrastructure. We still have people reading 150 pages of best practice documents, which once they're out, they're old, right? We still have people screening log files and stuff like that, right? And I think we can change all that. InfoSight is our technology. We're collecting data from all the sensors across compute, storage, our products, putting that into one big data pool and using growingly machine learning, deep learning to actually find patterns, help us to get rid of some of the base maintenance work, right? To optimize the infrastructure, and most importantly, increase availability by predicting failures and correcting them before they happen. But then on the other side, and you've probably seen HPE invest into quite some interesting companies recently, a little bit longer ago on the HPC side, SGI, we're closing the Quay acquisition. But then we've also invested into two companies, the second one pretty recently, Blue Data and MapR, basically to help you apply on this huge amount of data, AI machine learning techniques. Basically, Blue Data does virtualize and allow you to run various big data and machine learning and AI workloads and enable your data scientists to deploy kind of those software stacks pretty quickly. Today, for some of you that are doing that, especially bigger companies, you probably have isolated environments whenever a data scientist wants to to run something or build something, they build up a dedicated stack. So, quite interesting. And map brings us that connectivity to the edge as well, because they have a edge to cloud kind of solution here. So investing into those technologies to really, I think, move beyond kind of the infrastructure and enable you to run and deal with those workloads and actually succeed in the market. Another one, and it's just an example on how, just a fruit for thought for you as well. In-house, what we did is we went actually very much out of our comfort zone. You could say the memory-driven compute, the machine was still an IT development research project. Basically, this is another example. We worked with Continental. You probably know they do the tires. They're actually looking at how do they kind of change their business and develop it further, because it's getting tougher and tougher. And we worked with them on a blockchain-based platform solution, which basically we're now working with different car vendors, insurances and others, to enable them basically to securely trade kind of sensor data from the cars, for instance, right? I'm a German, so I'm a car lover, but take Volkswagen. They have plenty of cars on the street. One car might find a wet street, aquaplaning, the sensors indicated, but how does the BMW behind that car get that information, right? While they're all big, none of them is big enough to have full coverage. So that platform basically allows them to monetize that data from the front car, right? Sell it to other vendors securely, still stay in control of the ownership of that data, right? And others can buy it. Now, why is that interesting? Because as an IT vendor, it's quite unusual that we go into such business case. We invested people, resource, and stuff. There's not been a single dollar of revenue out of it. And as many of you were quarterly driven. So a lot of internal question and fights about how do we monetize this? But it's an example on how we also as an IT vendor have to change. And it's just, I want to just give you that as an example of, I think, we're at the beginning of a new era. I think compute is coming to an edge. We kind of own the edge as kind of, I think, economies of things, right? So there is an opportunity, but we need to act. Now I want to close with another Intel founder. And funny enough, that Intel was before, so we didn't sequence this. But Andy Grove, who wrote that famous book, right? Only the paranoid survive, right? That's really kind of the message. I think we're moving into a world where it's all about data. The sheer amount of data requires new approaches, because there's no way you can, like in your inventory database, you can process that and manage that by human beings. So things like, what's your AI strategy, right? And it's individual for every company, right? But as I said, there's ranges across all industries, and even the smallest, doctors might at some point in time be affected by that. Things are moving to the edge. So think about, where is your edge in your business, right? Where is there things, analog things, that get digitized? Because also remember, I spoke about opportunity and threats. If you don't do it, someone else might do it, right? Think about where are the things that you can digitize and build a business case out of it, right? And be creative and be open. And I think as HPE, as some of these examples show, hopefully, we want to support you with that. Things like making your infrastructure life easier, things like enabling to actually run very heterogeneous, diverse AI workloads and still be capable of managing and enabling a data scientist to do that. But also addressing that gap between processing and memory with the memory-driven compute capabilities, which you're going to see growingly come into our product going forward. So with that, I want to just close here and say thank you. As I said, if you want to see products, come to the booth. But really, I hope I gave you something to think about, Do you have a data? Do you have an edge strategy for your business, right? And is there an opportunity? Because I think there clearly is. With that, thank you.